Okay, I'm not sure if I thought Nora was coming back. Oh, there you are. Okay.
I'm here.
Okay, perfect. I think they started the webinar, so.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nora. I'm the CEO here at the CYAC. I wanted to first start with some Zoom housekeeping rules for today's webinar. Firstly, welcome to Boost CYAC's webinar series. This series will focus on the national guidelines for Canadian child advocacy centers and child and youth advocacy centers. Before we begin our session, there's a few quick housekeeping points. For participants who are listening in French, click on interpretation and choose French. The presentation in both English and French, as well as the presenter's bios, can be downloaded from the chat. There will be a Q&A during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Please type your questions in the Q&A tab, and you can submit your questions at any time. If you are watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group, in the chat. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to our facilitators, Tara Ettinger and Natasha Marshall. And before I do that, I would actually like to give a quick bio. So Natasha Marshall is a Métis woman and of Cree, Anishinaabe, Irish and Scottish descent, and a member of the Big Bear CYAC Steering Committee, representing the CYAC Child and Family Services. She is a program manager there, which is located in Tk'emlúps, the CYAC, and is grateful to have been a guest in the CYAC for her entire life. Natasha has been working in Indigenous child welfare for the last 18 years and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a Bachelor of Social. Tara Ettinger identifies herself as a settler ally and respectfully acknowledges her place of residence and work on the unceded territories of the CYAC Nation. She has been a counseling therapist for 20 years. Sorry, I aged you, Tara. The majority of those years was working with Indigenous communities. She has been trained by the Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc in Aboriginal group conferencing and as a restorative justice facilitator. She combined and adapted these practices to facilitate healing circles in different settings, such as elders circles, schools, and with residential school survivors. Much of our counseling work involved working with children and youth in trauma and in receiving disclosures of abuse. For many years, Tara held a contract to provide counseling for youth on probation, which gave her the clear understanding for the need of early intervention work. As part of a British Columbia provincial strategy to decrease youth violence and gang activity, Tara coordinated and chaired a network for a number of years She is a sessional and open learning instructor at Thompson Rivers University, Human Services and Social Work Department. She holds a Bachelor of Social Work, Master's in Counseling Psychology, which focused on the need for early intervention, and is currently a PhD candidate. She received a National SSHRC Doctoral Award for her work in better understanding children and youth needs during their disclosures of abuse. She's currently writing her dissertation, which specifically aims to better understand Indigenous children and youth's needs during investigations of child abuse, particularly regarding the forensic interview at a CYAC. At the end of 2015, she championed and started coordinating the development of the Big Bear Child and Youth Advocacy Center, where she is now the executive director. Tara, over to you.
Thanks, Nora. So first, we're recognizing and honoring the different Indigenous territories we're on in Kamloops, acknowledging the territory of the CYAC Nation. So as we're all here, we're going to talk about guideline 3, the main focus, having an inclusive practice. So the intent of this presentation is to promote and discuss, we'll promote discussion and thinking about inclusive practices. Before coordinating the development of Big Bear, I was a trauma therapist, as Nora was saying in my bio, and I had the honor and the privilege of being in many children and families' lives and hearing about their experiences as they were going through the investigation process. And these experiences is what has guided my learnings and how we can be inclusive, more inclusive in practice. And the reason why I was asked to share some of these experiences and insights that I gained from this, and then also to share some of the things that we're doing at Big Bear. So throughout this presentation, I do share some stories. I have altered some of the information in the stories just to help with confidentiality, but the gist of the stories will be there. I do also want to add, Natasha has been a big part of Big Bear since the conception. Oh. Sorry, I heard voices there. Everything's okay? Okay. So Natasha's been a big part of Big Bear since the very beginning of as a steering committee partner in developing the center. And her years of practice and experience has been such a wealth of knowledge, adding so much to our processes within the center. Natasha, did you want to add?
Tara, thank you. Waita Natasha Marshall and Squest. Hello everyone, I'm Natasha Marshall, and I'm really glad to be here today, Tara. Thank you for inviting me. I'll be sharing my perspectives from the practice, 18 years of practice, as well as being part of Big Bear. So hopefully I will come across as wise, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share. Thank you.
So just going through this presentation, just keeping in mind that many of the concepts that we talk about, even though we do have an Indigenous focus on several of the slides and topics, but a lot of these concepts can apply to various populations that face inequities based on their identity. So when we're looking at being inclusive with the diverse populations that we are working with, it goes hand in hand with trauma, and trauma has to be acknowledged and addressed when we're talking about inclusive practice and safe practices. So as we know, trauma affects our young population in many ways, such as development, navigational skills, attachment issues are, as you see, are a whopping 41 times more or 42 times more likely to have attachment issues. all these things, all possibly leading to longer term issues such as substance abuse, significant mental health issues, therefore, again, leading to additional situations such as like homelessness. So of course, our job is to not make it worse. Not only that, we all know that we're in a position of really helping and creating conditions that can mitigate the long-term adverse effects of child abuse, which helps us to be mindful of how the impact of the child's already existing traumas or traumas depend on many factors, including the services we're providing. Therefore, being trauma informed means we have to be aware and effectively address cultural factors. And cultural factors encompass just a massive amount of qualities that make up the individual. Culture is so deeply rooted, and we've all heard the term like peeling an onion to demonstrate everything that makes up the person, which essentially creates all the conditions for why we think and why we act. I love this quote: "The evidence from history and the study of 1,000 diverse cultures around the world are a testament to the overwhelming and coercive power of culture to mold who we are and what we believe." So we probably all have seen the iceberg used to make up the person, to demonstrate the makeup of the person, and how only a few of the qualities may become known or seen by outsiders. So what's easy to see is things like language, our physical looks, our dress, or the food we eat, the things that are hidden that we don't get to see in people too easily is things like pride, thought patterns, our concept of justice, our concept of fairness, family values, gender roles. So thinking about when we add trauma to the individual's cultural being, we need to be aware and consider that many of their qualities will be seen now through that lens. Therefore, thinking about our clients who have experienced trauma and come to our CYCs, CACs, there's so many factors that we do not know about their cultural being and how they view certain factors through their specific lenses. In 2019, I was at the San Diego International Conference on Child Family Maltreatment. And I went to a lot of workshops that opened my eyes, but one in particular, it was called Assessing for Trauma Exposure Among Immigrant Children. And this was presented by Michael, I'm probably going to wreck his name, but Michael de Arellano. He was, maybe still is, a senior associate dean for diversity at Medical University of South Carolina. Anyway, he got us to think about the possible additional traumas that our clients may have walking through our door. So for instance, for immigrant children and families, the possible trauma they may have experienced within their own country, the additional trauma they may have experienced fleeing from that country, and now the trauma of being in a new country and amongst cultures that would be different than what they're used to. So I think what that workshop helped me see is how sometimes the focus can be on the trauma as perhaps what brought them through our center's door, but realizing that sometimes clients may carry additional traumas. So we need to ask ourselves, then how do these have an impact, and how do they have an impact on their what they need from our services, and how do we address these needs to be more inclusive with their needs? So it's so important to remember that every individual brings with them their own unique blend of experiences, interpretation, values, norms, beliefs, customs, and everything that is within that iceberg has the ability to not only inhibit a child's willingness to disclose abuse or the witness's willingness to report the abuse or even believe the child or to protect the child, but even their feelings about being at our center. So what helps? Being more aware is what helps us to understand what our clients need. When we don't know about our clients, we don't know what support or accommodations may be needed. But when we learn about them, of course, we can implement practices that can help. We can be more inclusive in practice. That's being more culturally safe. That's being more culturally informed. So how do we enhance this in our practices? Becoming more knowledgeable about what's happening in general, asking ourselves, who are we serving at our centers? So general information in Canada, being knowledgeable about that more and more, we're becoming more and more diverse. There's one migrant every 2 minutes in Canada. Every major world religion and faith has a significant number of members. So many of us have generalized information about certain ethnicities or religions, but we really should be asking, what makes this family specific? What are their experiences? What are their beliefs? What are their needs? Would their beliefs have an impact on the child or the family's experience at our centers, or even during the forensic interview? So many of us may have long, in-depth referral forms that can help us understand more about the clients that are being referred to us. But realistically, sometimes referrals don't come in with everything filled out, or the referring agency or the person may not know everything about this child or the family to be able to fill out the referral form. And still, most referral forms really just cannot capture the client's experiences or just demonstrate some of the underlying issues, such as what we saw on the iceberg. So something that has really helped Big Bear to understand a lot more about who our clients are is our screening process and our initial triages. So our initial triage, our triage coordinator and facilitator connects the professionals that are already involved with the case right at the onset, so everyone can get the same information about the family that they are serving. And at the same time, the screener at Big Bear is contacting the family to learn about them, ask them questions. So then we can learn ways and try to tailor our services the best that we can when they're coming to our center. So we'll talk a little bit more about our screening processes further down in this presentation too. So something interesting to think about our diverse clients was a study that Statistics Canada did in 2020. They provided Canadians with an opportunity to share their experiences of discrimination. And although the results can't be generalized, it was well over 1/4 of the participants reported that they were experiencing discrimination or being treated unfairly over the course of the pandemic. So these results indicated how certain cultural groups, gender diverse groups, Indigenous women were among those who were more likely to report having discrimination. The results also demonstrated a strong link between experiencing discrimination and mistrust for service institutions. So these findings also correlate with another study that I found between, it was between collectivist and individualistic cultures. So interestingly, collectivistic cultures correlated with a narrower trust radius when compared with individualistic cultures, such as what we have in westernized societies. So this is something to think about regarding the level of trust with our clients who are from non-westernized societies and cultures, and how they may be feeling now being involved within welfare and the justice system, or even coming into our centers, period. I think, Natasha, you had something to add on this section too, didn't you?
I do, Tara, thank you. As I was preparing for this conversation, I found this quote describing inclusion, and I'd like to share it before I speak further. So inclusion is intentional. It's about identifying and removing barriers so that everyone can participate to the best of their abilities. And when I found that quote, it helped sort of ground me in what I was going to say today, Tara. I feel like the first thing I want to talk about is that when we're talking about mistrust and discrimination, we really want to examine how the systems that make up a CYAC may have led to harm and trauma for the families that we serve, and consider how the system that you're part of may have in fact created barriers. So you're working against that. You're working within a system maybe that has historically and maybe even currently creates barriers for Indigenous people. So you're going to have to take a really close personal look at the vision for the work you're doing. I think personally and professionally, the work you're doing with Indigenous people and across cultures, to really consider where do you need to unlearn? So rather than say learn, so I think we all have a lot to learn, but I actually think that we come into this work often with so much to unlearn about what we believe to be true about a population that is different than your own. And so what I would ask everyone to do is to really consider how are you going to ground yourself and prepare yourself to work in different and unfamiliar ways that are ultimately better for the children and families that we serve. So you're going to have to create space for families to move through their fear, move through that mistrust, to know that you genuinely want to know as much as possible about them and who their families are, so that you can provide service that is really centered around the child and not meeting the needs of the partners that are part of the CYAC. So we, of course, being part of a CYAC, everyone that comes to those multidisciplinary meetings and planning meetings is considering what they need from that. But what we need to move away from that and really consider what the families need from us and what the children need from us. So I would say just focusing on everyone's individual strengths, their challenges, asking as many questions as you can, and really letting the children and families lead you through this process. You need to action the feedback that you're getting from families. So if you're gathering information, you need for it to show up in the work you're doing with them. So that's what I would say around just moving through that discrimination and trust, is you have to examine what you know and what you don't know about the history of Indigenous people, and also currently what that looks like. And so I wanted to share when I wrap this up, because I was preparing for this and I came across some really wise words from a woman that I deeply admire, Kelly Foxcroft-Poirier of White Raven Consulting. And the quote that I'm sharing is, you need to seek to center the comfort, timing, and well-being of the entire family so that the resulting work is deep, relational, it shows care, and is therefore wise. And so I would ask that everyone who is part of a CYAC really considers that quote and the work they're doing, is you need to center everything around the children and families, the comfort they feel, even if it puts you in a really uncomfortable position. That's important. You need to make yourself uncomfortable to help these families move through this really, really scary, potentially one of the most traumatic experiences of their life. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. I love how you indicated sometimes in order to learn and understand, we have to unlearn. I really like that. Thank you. So for, like Natasha's saying, for our First Nations, Métis and Inuit populations, there's just a long history of understandable mistrust. And research shows how this lack of trust for government programs is still felt by our Indigenous populations. And then Natasha, jump in when you, on any of these as well.
Well, I think I captured what I just said with this slide as well.
Perfect, yeah. So it's so important, as Natasha was talking about too, it's so important to understand our history and the historical traumas that have been passed down from generation to generation in order to create the services that can be inclusive and safe. So a common message shared with me in many of the Indigenous communities that I've worked with is around the repeated cycle of trauma. Families have shared with me how they've worked so hard to not have that cycle repeat itself, yet somehow trauma surfaces within the family, whether it's through mental health, through substance abuse, violence, abuse, or all of it. Parents I've worked with who were either residential school survivors themselves or had parents who were residential school survivors have shared the challenges in trying not to have that trauma enter their families, and that they see how the communication amongst them becomes strained because it was just something that was not continually modeled for them due to the histories of separation. Families see these challenges and they are working on these challenges, yet so many individuals have described feeling judged and blamed. And this, unfortunately, is what many Indigenous members are still feeling today when they access services. They're carrying this with them. Natasha, did you want to add to that?
I don't think I have anything. I think you've covered it, Tara.
So we also need to be mindful of how our systems, like Natasha talked about, was, our practices, they were built on European ideology and the impact this may have on our non-European or Westernized populations. So not just thinking about interpretations of classification systems, so things like how we define neglect, but also how we base our assessments on clients, keeping in mind that we are always conducting assessments from the time we meet children and family. Assessments are done formally, but they're also done informally, and we're all making assessments. So for example, the question of taking a look at how are we determining if and when a child is ready or even able to be in the forensic interview yet. We need to consider our assessing practices. Who are they determined by? And does it factor in things such as culture? And Natasha, you had an assessment example too that we talked about last time.
I do. So here in British Columbia, we use structured decision-making tools in our child protection, family development responses and our investigations. So these structured decision-making tools are used to assess safety, determine level of risk. And immediately when we were talking about this, Tara, what came to mind for me is a tool we use to talk about, we're assessing vulnerability for future risk and harm. And over the years, I can say that I've seen that bias for Indigenous people. So I've only ever worked with Indigenous families. And so this tool almost inevitably reaches a level of high risk or the highest level of risk comes out. And that's due to a variety of factors. So socioeconomic is one of them. And my concern about these structured decision-making tools is that the natures of the tools, if they're the driver in determining the next steps of a child protection investigation, if that tool is being used as the primary reason we would stay involved in a family's life or potentially have a child leave their parental care, then we're continuing the cycle of Indigenous children being overrepresented in the child welfare system. So that's where I've seen an example of, we're working through an assessment and we're working through a child protection response, and we're feeling really confident in what we're learning about this family, that we feel that their children are safe, that the level of risk of future harm to the children is low. And then we're required to complete this assessment tool, and it rates them as high. So there's a great disconnect there. So what we need to place more value on is the actual in-person interactions with the families and the communities that we're serving, versus an assessment tool that I think has inherent bias against Indigenous people.
Yeah, absolutely. So even the term best interests of the child, we need to explore who is determining what's best for the children. So an example story was shared with me by an instructor when I was doing my undergrad in social work. And this story was about an Indigenous family. It was a grandma taking care of several of her grandchildren, and it was a non-Indigenous support worker coming into the family just as a support. But then, after the visit was over, sharing the concern for the kids that there just was not food in the fridge. There wasn't adequate food in the fridge, and had a deep concern for the kids. And it wasn't until later learned that actually this grandma had a root cellar that it had an abundance of food in there. And so again, just taking a look at cultural aspects when we're determining what is best for the kids. And I think, Natasha, you had an example here too.
Yeah, I do, Tara. I don't know if you recall when we were first talking about it, best interest, it took me a while to sort of settle into how I would talk about best interest. And so I just wanted to share one of the teachings that I've been given through these years of unlearning in the child welfare system, working in the child welfare system, is that culture is safety. So when we talk about culturally safe, creating cultural safety, what I've been taught is that culture is safety. And so really when I was thinking about your story about the foods in the home and is I think that really just speaks to taking the time to understand, to get a sense of from the family what they value versus what the system you're part of values. You need to really consider the mandate of your organization. If it really truly is focused on safety, then you are asking respectful questions about their culture, so that you're making sure that the way you respond or how you interpret the information actually is fair and is actually in their best interest of this family. So if you're not doing that, then you're not creating a culturally safe space. If you're not asking questions that are really respectful and kind, so that you can show the families you work with that you're genuinely curious about who they are. And I would say in all instances of the work I do, and have done over the years, that if you're not including culture, then you're not acting in the best interest of any child. Mm-hmm. So we can talk about best interest in a lot of different ways, but when we're focusing on it from a cultural lens, that if you are not finding ways to bring culture into the work you're doing, and not the way you think it should be brought in, but how the family is directing you or in educating you around what their family culture is, what their the culture of their home is, the culture of their community is, so that you can make sure that that working relationship really does center around the child. If we're not child-centered, then we're not really seeking to work in the best interest of a child.
Yeah, good points, Natasha. So like Natasha was saying, best interests must include culture. So back to collectivist and individualistic views for a little bit. Collectivistic cultures emphasize membership and loyalty to the groups, such as how traditionally Indigenous cultures place value on the principle of connectivity and relationships. Individualistic cultures and ideologies tend to focus more on the personal rights and goals. So when we think about the best interests of children ideology, it has been criticized for years by Indigenous communities because the focus implies that children's needs are considered in isolation and separate and distinct from those of their families and their communities. And so when we're thinking about, Indigenous children coming into our centers and disclosing abuse, really there's a whole other impact that is going on for these kids. So we need to consider how westernized approaches within the legal system in responding to child abuse, sexual assault in particular, often conflict with Indigenous ideology. So involving the community and working towards resolution versus separation from the abuser, possibly adding additional hesitancy for the child of being involved within the system, hesitancy disclosing abuse, or even being at the CYAC period. So this quote is quite impactful from Government of Canada. Victims often don't want to disclose patterns of abuse if it means their relatives will have to go to jail. Communities do not believe that a legal solution is really a solution at all. Many Aboriginal people believe that the legal system of the dominant society does not address the root causes of the imbalance that allowed the abuse to occur in the first place. So there's other issues creating barriers, things like communication factors. It can create barriers within our services or even for disclosures of abuse. So for example, in Western societies, we often view eye contact as showing sincerity in conversation, and not making eye contact can send messages of boredom or disinterest. Often with Indigenous communication, eye contact is often not identified as a courtesy within conversation at all. In fact, during residential school, eye contact with school personnel sometimes led to physical punishment. Therefore, not having eye contact may then became the norm, perhaps being handed down generation to generation. But for many Indigenous peoples, the preference is to concentrate on listening rather than maintaining eye contact. When I first started working with Indigenous children and families during my time as a counselor, I remember wondering if some of my clients just weren't interested. As usually counseling is more of a back and forth conversational process, more coming from the clients. However, many of the Indigenous clients, I do remember them just not giving me eye contact, or there would just be so much silence in our sessions, them not saying much. However, what I noticed is on follow-up sessions, these same clients would provide sharing and insight about the session we had last. So eventually this made me realize that I needed to change my expectations for having a back and forth conversation to a process that allowed and encouraged processing and reflection time. So it was me altering my process and not the clients altering for me. And so something that I've seen our forensic interviewers help with this is having pre-meetings with some of the children and youth. And sometimes they've occurred at Big Bear. But I've noticed that this really has helped provide time for the children and youth to process. And Tasha, did you have anything to add there?
I want to reiterate what you're saying, Tara, so I can speak from my years in the work and continue in the role that I'm in now, although it comes a lot more naturally to me. So at the beginning of my career, I definitely was someone who came into the work being raised that you maintain eye contact, you do a firm handshake, and quickly learning, like you said, to not misinterpret that. So to not interpret the lack of eye contact, the silence, for anything other than what it is. And so really taking the time to figure out how can you shift how you work. And I would say it's mirroring your client. So we don't want to generalize. There, you may work with an Indigenous client who does maintain eye contact, but really mirror what the client is doing. And I'm thinking specifically of the work at Big Bear is in those forensic interviews or in those prep meetings, is really mirror the client and watch to see how that might shift the interaction and the comfort level of your client. Because really, ultimately, that's what we're seeking, is to have the child or the family become as comfortable as possible at the center. Learning to be comfortable with natural silence is, it's incredible. You don't realize, I think, the power of that silence. And I've had those moments where I've really had to keep quiet. And then in that silence, the person that I'm working with or interacting with actually does speak. I just need to take the time to listen and wait. And so I would say that we need to really focus on how, you talked about collectivistic culture or societies is around listening is so highly valued versus communication. So talking. So listening is so highly valued. And some of the previous slides you talked about, or the one you have up here now around relatives going to jail. And I think, like, as from an Indigenous perspective, that you don't think of yourself outside of your, you are your family, you are your community. And so you're thinking of you're considering the interests of all versus self. And so I think we have to keep that in mind, that it is all around, how does this impact everyone that I'm connected to? Where sometimes the partners and the systems that we're part of with the CYAC, we may be thinking about, we have this little person maybe in front of us, but we need to recognize they're potentially being raised in a way that they don't think of themselves as, they are their family. And I would say that for myself. I don't identify myself as, I identify myself as a daughter, a sister, a mother, an auntie. Like, that's how I define myself. And so I think that everything I do, I'm thinking, how does that impact my family? How does that impact where I come from and who I am as a person? So I think, like, we need to really, as we've been saying all along, pausing and really considering, how we're doing this work. How is it meeting the needs of the families? How is it not? And those pauses are beautiful. I think that if we were to share anything, is to be inclusive, is to pause and to really slow down the work. I will say that. I don't know if it'll come up in another part of this conversation, but the greatest gift that a child and youth advocacy center gives is that opportunity to pause a bit and take a deep breath before you jump in to some of these abuse allegations. Really pauses the work. And I think that if you are careful about not assigning value, so we love to assign value, we assess, we're always assessing, as we talked about. Be careful not to assign value that is based on your own experiences. So if I were to go into the work I did and someone didn't shake my hand firmly, I have to quiet the voice of my father saying that you can judge a person by how firmly they shake your hand, when that is actually opposite in the work with Indigenous people. That is viewed as a threat. And so a soft handshake is actually a better barometer of someone's character. So I think, like, if you can just really consider the differences that the families that will come to you, and this would include many different cultures. So we're speaking, of course, from my experience as an Indigenous person and as someone who's worked in Indigenous child welfare, but across cultures, there's going to be so many different norms and practices, and it's being really curious about what this represents for you, not how I think what it means. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Natasha. So, like Natasha was saying, we need to not only decolonize our professional practice, but we need to decolonize our lenses, the unlearning, like you were saying, so we can promote health and healing and address past and current experiences of trauma into all service delivery models through a victim-centered practice, like Natasha was saying. So for the young people in the work we do, this practice demonstrates the need for a child-centered approach, which child-centered approach highlights children's rights to have their needs understood before services are even implemented. and the need for professionals to take the responsibility to understand those needs. So I found in the Canadian Bar Association, I think it was the 2018 edition, it discussed the importance of implementing a child's rights-based approach in which professionals start with the child to inform the rest of their work. So essentially this means working outward from the child to understand their lived reality first considering them, where they reside, their age, their culture, their gender identity, and so forth. This was comparable to what Honorable Judge Donna Martinson said when she presented to our BC CYAC network gathering in 2018. She indicated how the work we do in the advocacy centers needs to incorporate a child's rights approach. And then she followed that by saying, rights are meaningless without the implementation of. So understanding that not everyone should be treated the same or implementing a standard approach. Rather, it's acknowledging individual differences and perspectives, so determining and addressing unique needs can be achieved. Being safe and inclusive in practice should be determined by our clients. So we do need to ask ourselves, who's determining our cultural safety in our centers? Do our evaluations capture this? So backing up a little bit, let's explore how do we learn about our clients in order to be inclusive and safe as much as we can. So like Natasha talked about, it really starts with understanding our own beliefs, our biases, our assumptions. So I'll share a little story that I call Thanksgiving Turkey Story, because I reflected a lot on this one. And it's just helped me further with my approaches. And so this was when I was younger and working in an Indigenous community, and it was after a long weekend, after the long Thanksgiving long weekend. And the children and youth that I was seeing, I was asking them about their long weekend. And I remember this one particular person, I asked if they had turkey this weekend. And I'll never forget the look that this young person gave me. And I wasn't sure quite what it meant, but the look to me looked like I created something challenging for this child. I created some discomfort of some sort. I'm not sure what it was. I'm not sure if it's that maybe this person, they didn't practice Thanksgiving. Maybe they didn't have the means to have turkey. I'm not sure, but it created something uncomfortable. And, we worked through the session. It felt like it was a good session. And I just remember at the end of that session, as that person was leaving, before leaving the door, they turned to me and they said, and by the way, I had hamburgers. So I don't know what was going on for that child, but I'll talk about this, how this Thanksgiving turkey story helped me later on. So being reflexive in our practices, we can learn from them. So like that Thanksgiving turkey story did for me, reflecting on this experience helped shape things I needed to consider in my future practice. So examining our practices, our assumptions, our reasons for why we do what we do, and using our experiences to learn how we can do even better and be committed to this. It's such a simple tool, but it's one that we can so easily forget when we get busy. Be committed to learning and understanding. So acknowledging, learning, and understanding the uniqueness of not just our individuals, but the territories and the communities of the people where they're, where they're coming from, who we serve. I added an appendix at the end of the slide, just different ways of really understanding our history with Indigenous communities. Just some examples there. And then being respectfully curious regarding all the qualities of our clients. So being respectfully curious is learning about who we're serving. So one time I was working with a young Indigenous person who was dealing with the loss of a loved one. And it was so hard to see this person in so much pain. And I was very, very close to discussing the concept of heaven and that their loved one was in a better, was at peace. And even though my intent was totally good, I am so thankful that I remember the Thanksgiving turkey story, because instead of sharing my beliefs with this person, I chose to be respectfully curious and ask this person about their beliefs when a person dies. And what I learned about this young person's cultural beliefs and traditions about death and dying was so amazing and so beautiful that I'm not sure if I would have had the same teachings if I had gone ahead and told this person about my beliefs. So gathering information about the people we work with, it's also around timing. It's also about being trauma informed, not wanting to overwhelm the person, but it's thinking about interacting with them without assumption or imposing our norms on our beliefs and our traditions. So a lot of the gathering of information about the people we serve occurs at screening, like I discussed earlier, but we do this continuously. So obviously the forensic interviewer is gathering information during the forensic interview. And the forensic interview is a wonderful time for our family advocates to learn more about the families. They're hanging out with the caregivers during that time. And then after the forensic interview, our family advocates are learning about the child, because now they're with the child debriefing after the forensic interview. So we're gathering lots of information from the moment we're getting the referral and continuously while we're working with them. Natasha, did you want to add? I kind of jumped ahead on slides.
No, just as we're moving through these slides, Sarah, I'm really thinking about that quote that I started off with around inclusion being identifying and removing barriers so that everyone's voices are heard. And everything we're talking about here is about identifying and removing those barriers so that the voices of the children and families we work with are heard. And I think by heard in terms of what they may need going through this process, but also helps us know who they are, so that when you're in the forensic interview, you're prepared. You have a stronger sense of who this child is and what their needs may be. You're going to have to change how you move through the forensic interview. If you don't have all that screening information, you're probably going to move through the interview as you always have done. And that will impact the information you gather. It's all sort of comes together, right? So you're taking the time to create some trust with the families you're working with, getting to know them, and really you're lifting them up so that their voices are heard. And so I think it's all fitting together when we talk about not making assumptions, about thinking as experts we know what this child or this family might need from us, because I'm sure that what's been learned since Big Bear has started is that you go with maybe what the last family suggested, and then that doesn't work. So it's trial and error. And I think it's like really tailoring each experience as much as possible to the family that's in front of you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's so important for professionals to understand the diverse worldviews and to recognize that every child they encounter is a unique cultural being with a distinct assembly of norms. Efficient work with children means practice needs to adapt to who this child is and what they need. Collaboration with diverse cultures is also key. So for Big Bear, it's essential to collaborate with our Indigenous partners, not only because of our history, but because Kamloops includes many urban and rural Indigenous populations, all unique within their own communities. So gaining the guidance from Indigenous professionals and elders to understand how we can adapt our approaches, being familiar with the culture we're working with. This alerts us to some of the uniqueness and can help us design our interventions. And again, what is best for Indigenous children and families is Indigenous culture needs to be at the forefront of practice. The success of Big Bear rests on a solid relationship we have with our Indigenous partners. They've been there since the conception of the start of our CYAC project. We had a lot of pre-existing relationships with our Indigenous partners and between our non-Indigenous and Indigenous professionals. So collaboration came a little bit easy, but there was still a respectful guideline that we followed, which you can look up different sources. But basically, the notion is identify the nations you're working with, see what's overlapping territory, then learn, have a holistic understanding of the communities, the history, the traditions, the tribal council affiliations, decision-making structures, roles of the leaders, elders. Then you're planning, creating an engagement plan. You're building for an inclusive and mutual relationship. When you're engaging, you are building trust and you're establishing those relationships. And this does take time. We do need to honor that there's been a history of mistrust. So our goal is maintaining these relationships for a long-term partnership so we can have that continuous learning and engaging. Around the same time I started coordinating the development of Big Bear, I wanted to understand how we can better our approaches and be more inclusive with our Indigenous populations within the CYAC work we do. So I chose to do my PhD as a student through UBC, so I could not only have an ethics process and a PhD committee, but also create an Indigenous committee to help guide my methodological process. Anyways, as I first began consulting with my Indigenous colleagues about how to start this work, I was asked to first differentiate if I was looking for answers or if I truly wanted to understand. And so this statement to me demonstrates how we have the ability to do this with all our clients. And it often becomes a choice regarding what do we choose to do within our practices. So the use of multidisciplinary teams in CYCs are logical places for identifying and understanding cultural aspects. So our MDT planning meetings. So also at the onset of when a case is first referred to us, we offer, after guardian consent, MDT planning meetings. So different agencies, professionals can share just pertinent information about the child or the case. The information we gather at screening is also shared. This allows us to learn what the child, the family may need when they first come to the center, but as well as the forensic interviewer can then prepare a tailored interview. So like last week's webinar with Michelle Sire, I believe you pronounce it that way, but her presentation last week, she talked about forensic interviewers need to know certain information about the child to prepare, so you can prepare for the interview. So like many times, these MDT planning meetings have allowed us to learn just unique qualities about the child that the forensic interviewer would not have known prior to the interview. And Natasha, did you want anything else to add there?
The only thing I would add is that when I reflect back on my frontline practice, that how much I would have appreciated being part of a MDT planning meeting where we all come together and have a clear vision moving forward for what the next steps are. Just the beauty of slowing down the process to make sure that there are some discussion around who's doing what and how do we minimize the confusion and chaos that comes along sometimes with when a family's been advised that there has been an allegation and that this is moving forward. It's just, I feel like when I think back on some of my experiences, like how I'd like to think that I didn't cause a lot of harm in my practice, but I think back to sometimes when we move so quickly through the work that if we slowed it down and we had these planning meetings, like how much more supported the family would have maybe felt through the process and felt safe to speak up about what they need through the process, and then focusing on what's next. I think that that's something you're going to be talking about, is that the aftercare and ongoing support is such a critical part of this work. It doesn't just end with the forensic interview and off we go. So that's what I'll add, is that I wish that I was part of MDT planning meetings when I was in my frontline work.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. So with our initial screening process, we're inquiring if, we're also inquiring if the child or the family already has a support worker or a family worker working with the Indigenous families. It makes sense to have them come to Big Bear during the child's forensic interview, and then they become more of the family advocate supporting our child and family while they're at the center. Our family advocates are still there, but they're more helping out with process stuff and just working alongside with the family worker. The outcome has been amazing, especially in cases when a child has distinct needs and the worker already has the means and the understanding to address them. On a couple of occasions, our forensic interviewers were able to consult with the family worker when they needed more information about perhaps the child's presenting behaviors during the interview or just a little helping hand. So this has been just, yeah, an amazing program. Natasha, anything?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is just really give kudos. I think that this is a great example of flexibility in practice. And so even though as we're moving through developing Big Bear and through the phases, is that there was this vision originally for what the advocate would look like and what their role would be. And I think that this is a perfect example of how Big Bear has paused and reflected on whether or not that actually is in the best interest of the families we work with. Does it actually meet their needs? And what you're seeing from what we've talked about, Tara, is that when families are able to identify the person that they view as their support or advocate, and then bringing them along, as well as having the advocate participate in whatever the family needs them, like in what level they need that advocate to be present from Big Bear, I think that that's a perfect example of inclusion, of making sure that we aren't just moving forward because this is how it's been done. We're actually pausing and reflecting on how can we do the work differently, and how can we make sure that the family has what they need to move through the process versus us telling them what they may need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So again, between our initial screening process and our family advocates spending time with the caregivers, and then again with the child, and after having the forensic interview or medical evaluation, we've gathered a lot of information about the child and the family. So with guardian consent, we have these weekly MDT mental health wellness referral team meetings. On this team, we have the Big Bear screener, we have the family advocates, we have mental health clinician, we have the district-wide behavior consultant from the school district, we have interior health representative, and together we discuss the family and then come up with several referral suggestions for the family and for our family advocates to take back to our caregivers and kids. And I think what we've noticed is this does help reduce referral bias, which can happen. And it increases a lot of the out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to different healing options. And so the other bonus to these meetings is it's become a great resource for our family advocates and just our team to be able to debrief on some of the cases. It truly has become just a weekly team meeting resource for all of us. And the families have always been excited to hear the outcomes of these meetings, to just understand, yeah, what are some of the referral sources. And there's been some really, like I said, out of the box thinking as far as options, after our family advocates have learned, what kind of healing methods or culturally or cultural methods of healing are. And so, there's been different things like drumming groups that we found, or even equestrian therapy groups and stuff like that. So just, yeah, some different things. It's been really, really a great program. Natasha, anything there?
No, I just wanted to say that the focus on healing is really significant. I think that we need to reflect on that being part of the role of a CYAC, is that what's next. I think that families, and from my experience, families going through when there is an investigation, that they need to know, they need to have a sense of what might be next and what's available for them. And I love that we're thinking outside the box and not having a really narrow view of what mental health support might look like or what healing might look like.
Yeah. And so applying this level of care inclusivity with our colleagues is also important. We all know that when we take care of each other, it reflects on the people that we're working with. So sometimes it's even the little things that help everyone feel like they're part of the team. So for instance, updating the forensic interviewers with some of the positive outcomes in cases. So many times, like our forensic interviewers, they're hearing and seeing stories when families are at their worst. And so sometimes these updates just have really helped interviewers gain some closure, but I think also enhances the inclusivity as a team. Food always brings people together. Research shows how food always has been a part of human interaction and how it does enhance relationship and trust. This is a photo of a little basket of food in our monitor room. And we have bigger baskets in our family room with a variety of diverse snacks. So always there's food everywhere in Big Bear. Natasha, do you want to add to that?
Just as we talked about before, Tara, like food and offering water or something to drink really is a universal language that can be seen across cultures, where you're offering someone comfort by offering them that. So I just think it's really nice and makes me want to come visit.
And we have a grandma who makes homemade bear paw cookies that have been a real hit too. So people want to come for those. Seniors in our community have found a way to be inclusive in caring for the young clients that come to Big Bear. So, and what's cool is when the children and youth learn how these slippers were made with love by some of the grandmas in our community, you can see on their faces the meaning that this has for them. And it's pretty cool, this connection that this has between some of our seniors and the kids without even seeing each other. It's pretty incredible. So this is our family room at Big Bear. This is where our family advocates first bring the children and families prior to the forensic interview. And only when the children say they're ready to meet the RCMP member that's going to interview them, then we bring that person in, call them by their first name. So we'll bring Phil or Shar in to the room, and they start their rapport there. We have had a few cases where some children and youth have needed quite a bit of time before they met their forensic interview. They thought they were ready, and then when they get to the family room, they just needed a little bit of time to maybe reduce some anxiety or stress, or just be ready, be present. This is where the families hang out with the caregivers during the interview. But the other use of this room is also for circles. In some cases, it's been very beneficial to have the team come together in cases where maybe there's confusion or just needing to work together. And so by the team, I mean family. Big Bear and any of the other agencies that are involved with the case. This room is also used to help bridge the ongoing supports, the other agencies that might be referred. So in some occasions, we've had children and their families just hesitant or feeling shy or just feeling a little nervous about meeting a new agency. And so we have partners, we have some great partnerships in our community that there's just been no hesitancy for them to come over to Big Bear for either their first session or just to even meet and greet them for the first time. So this is where we're just bridging some of our clients with additional agencies. Natasha, anything else?
I think you've covered it. I think that it just speaks to creating space and holding space. And so I know that I'm glad to hear that our community partners are willing to come and meet the clients where they're at and to start off in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, partnerships and teamwork helps to make everyone who is a part of the center feel a real sense of ownership within the center. This encourages us working together, sharing ideas, and this has also enhanced how we've grown. So this room is an elder space. This room helps to encourage the traditional importance of connection and relationship. We're building a remote court testimony room, so this elder space is in that room. It was just perfect because we've actually had a couple of Indigenous youth that have come to Big Bear and share that actually the family they wish they had supporting them at Big Bear actually didn't live in the community. And so it just made sense to put this space in our CCTV room because the equipment's already there. And so with some of the families, the thought is we can Zoom them in if families are out of town, if they're not in town to support the kids that are coming. Anything else, Natasha, about that?
No, I just think this is a really beautiful example of inclusion and making sure that when children or youth or families identify who may need to be there, that we're making it happen, that we're creating that opportunity for them.
Yeah, totally. Right from when they come in the front door, we don't have automatic door lockers on the Big Bear front door. We have the old-fashioned latch. It's actually a 100-year-old building. So, but when families come in, they know they're the only ones that are coming into Big Bear, and so we lock the door behind them. But on a few occasions, we've asked, out of convenience, just ask families to, if they didn't mind locking the door behind them, just so no one else walks in on us. And the feedback we've had from family is just that feeling of locking the door felt like the feedback has been, they just feel like they're protecting their kids, and it felt like home, and it just reminded them of it felt safe. And so it was just such an easy thing to make it part of our process. We don't lock the door anymore. We ask our families to do it since it just, since it's kind of enhancing that feeling of safety a little bit. And then at the very beginning, families know ahead of time who's going to be at Big Bear. Our advocates explain the process, what's happening. They explain and get permission on occasions to who's going to be at Big Bear when they're there for the interview. But again, families have just really appreciated the being transparent about who's at Big Bear. They can see it when they come in. And just a little suggestion about, we do have practicum students, just a little suggestion about practicum students to not ask in front of the family, have the student there in front of the family when you're asking if it's okay to involve a practicum student. This is something that it ideally should be pre-planned, and just let families have the opportunity to say no instead of them feeling awkward and in front of the practicum student being right there. And then also really thinking about we don't ask all families if it's okay to have a practicum student there, just based on how are they doing. There's some families that are just in significant trauma that just adding an extra layer of questions and getting that consent can be a little bit stressful. Natasha, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I think you've covered it, Tara.
And then lastly, just a message from our children and youth themselves. Repeatedly, I'm sure you get this with all of the kids that visit your center. They say they just want to know that they're not alone, that they're not the only ones that have gone through this. And so, you know, many times at the center, children and youth have asked, you know, they want details, who's been there. And so we can say anyone from 2 to 18, and it can be various genders and any, you know, different times of the day. We can't be specific. But we had a youth in particular wanted to asked if it was okay to leave a message on our chalkboard. So this is our child and youth room that our advocates bring our child and youth after the forensic interview to debrief. And so this one youth in particular said, can I leave a message for the next youth coming to Big Bear? And so that's actually changed our practice. That is becoming a part of our practice. It's like a pay it forward message, and it's connecting youth to each other without even knowing each other. And so our advocates are letting families, letting children know before they come to Big Bear that, hey, there is a message for you. And they're coming into the center excited to see their message. But then even after the forensic interview, they're excited to leave a message for the next youth that's coming to the center. And so some of the messages that I've been allowed to share. You're not alone. I know it can be hard, but you got this. You are loved. You are strong. The other advantage of this little practice is it actually helps us see how the children and youth are doing during debriefing. How are they feeling based on their messages? Well, they're feeling loved. They're feeling strong. They're feeling that this is hard, but you're going to be okay. And on a few times, yeah, we've been able to maybe see where sometimes some youth are struggling, and it just allows us to connect at a deeper level. So it's just been a really, just want to share this with you. It's, you know, chalkboards are this, it's just a paint on chalkboard, and it's been our widely used tool. It's been fantastic. And that's it. Thank you. And Natasha, anything closing before we put it out?
I just say thank you for the opportunity, Tara, to be here with you today. And I just want to emphasize how proud I am to be part of Big Bear, and grateful that this has been part of my journey in this work. And it means more to me than you'll ever know. Coach Tresham, thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And truly, we do have an amazing team, and this is why we're able to do what we do, for sure. For some reason, I can't get into the Q&A. It's not showing online. Nora, is there a way you could help us?
I can see it, Tara.
Oh, can you see it? Okay.
So the question is, how do you keep MDT members engaged long-term?
Yeah, it really is. I think when we look at it, it's been relationship. It's been connecting. And a lot of times it's about connecting, not about the MDT or not about work. It's about connecting and maintaining those relationships to really help with the MDT. And I don't know if, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know if you're here, Tracy, but you facilitate and coordinate these MDTs. Is
They're not able to speak. I don't think they're able to participate unless they can be unmuted by the host.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. There's a couple questions or asking our thoughts, Tara, in the chat. So thank you to those who have given us some really positive feedback. And Lindsay, we're really happy that you're going to implement the chalkboard idea. And then we have a question around, what are your thoughts about asking if the child is Indigenous on the referral form? We have indicated on there that we are asking in order to provide culturally aware, sensitive practice. There has been debate around this. So I'll speak to it. So in our work, so the way we would work from Secwepemc Family Services is that if a caseworker receives a report, a child protection report, and then the decision is made that it's going to be referred to Child and Youth Advocacy Center here in Kamloops, it would be known that they're Indigenous because they're being served by us as a delegated Aboriginal agency. So we serve First Nations and Inuit people. And then as well, we have a delegated agency in Kamloops, Lemisif Otipamisiwak, LMO, is our delegated agency for Métis families. So it would be known from the very beginning that the family is Indigenous and how they're Indigenous. I find it interesting that it's a debate, but I would need to know more. I would say for us, it's just, it's asked prior to coming to the center. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Tara. I just think here in Kamloops that is our practice, is that they come to the center with, Big Bear has that knowledge from the start.
Yeah, and I think because we have different levels of kind of screening. So again, you know, with our triage, you know, sometimes there's just information that's found out there where it's like, okay, this family is Indigenous. But then also through our screening process. So while the triage is going on, we're doing the screening. And so we are connecting with the family before they're even coming to the center. And so having those conversations. So we are lucky, we are fortunate that we do have our 2 delegated Aboriginal agencies. So if our referrals are coming from there, then we know. But it's also about screening for other cultures as well. And so just because it's coming from maybe, you know, MCFD, it's again, we're having those conversations during our screening and that connection with our family right at the beginning. It's like, tell me about you, you know, tell me about what we can do at our center to help you. And we also have to be mindful, like, there's the culture of the family, there's the culture of the community. So it's not just ethnicity, but it's also, you know, what can we learn about this family that's also going to help make this experience as safe as possible when they're coming to our center. So that conversation is a reach out at the very beginning to understand. And then that's followed up with our family advocates. After we've done the screening, our family advocates are then connecting with the families before they come to the center to have that conversation again. So maybe things were missed at our screening and our triage. Then our family advocates are now building that connection and, hey, tell me about you. And what are some things that would be great to know about you or your child? And sometimes they are getting the child or the youth right on the phone as well, or FaceTime before they even come. So there's just different levels of ways to get information.
Lindsay's responding as well in this discussion around families who that information is included, and then when they meet with the family, they may not disclose their cultural identity, or they may be Indigenous but not feeling connected to their culture. So that really speaks to me, Lindsay, through my work. And I think that through our presentation, I guess I would hope that the message would be is like, we're letting the family lead us. So while we would say, hey, we see that you're from, you know, the named community, or if they don't have a named community, that you're First Nations, is just be curious about what that means for them. And then follow their lead. You would just make sure they know that there are opportunities to be connected culturally, but we would always respect, and that would be the same within Secwepemc Child Family Services. We would offer opportunity, we would be really curious about where they're from, and we would let them lead us through that work. And yeah, there's no more questions in there, but I'm just going to take a peek at the Q&A. What process do you employ? So one of the questions, I know we only have 5 more minutes. We have 2 more questions. So the one question is, how do you employ post? Then it's a question for me, which I'm happy to answer if we have time. But what process do you employ post-interview family evaluation? Do you send out surveys? So I don't know if you can answer that, Tara, fairly quickly. Do we send out surveys? How do we gauge families' feedback?
Yeah, and that's ongoingly with our family advocates. And again, sometimes those break into circles if there's, you know, if we need to get into a circle and have further discussion. But our family advocates are doing extensive follow-up with the family. So it's like you said, it's not just the forensic interview experience, but it's also that maintaining that connection. And then we do have our, our evaluations. Again, those are, thinking about our families and where they're at, sending them an evaluation to fill out as well. So different means and different approaches. And just, again, I think a lot of it is the connection that we're having with the families ongoingly.
So the last question here is, I wonder if Natasha would be comfortable going a little further into how she identifies herself. She says she identifies as an aunt, sister, mother, etc. It is really interesting to me. Does that mean you identify mostly in terms of relationship? That's the only way I identify myself, is in the relationships I have. So I have a strong sense of self, but I only know myself through my family relationships. So I only know myself as a daughter, as a sister, auntie, mother, one day grandmother. So yeah, that's the only way I identify myself, is how I'm connected. And when we introduce ourselves, we've been taught to introduce ourselves we introduce ourselves, we introduce our mother. If you're a woman, I think we always start matrilineally. So I introduce my mother and father, and then I would introduce my grandparents, so that you're calling your ancestors to you, and so that you're letting the people know that you're in the room you're with, who you're connected to and where you belong. So that's the only way I know myself, is through the people that I'm related to, through blood and through choice. So there's no more in the Q&A that I can see. And then I guess we have 2 minutes. And so I just want to, Lindsay's responding, so that my response reminds me of some valuable knowledge I learned in diversity training we took as a team recently. Our Indigenous teacher taught us how we all come from someone's belly button. Our being is our relationships. And I would say that is absolutely true. And that relationship, like you repeated that word a few times, Tara, around how do you maintain that engagement from the MDT partners. But I would say across all the work we do with children and families and communities is around relationship. So it really is focusing more on relationship before anything else. We have 1 minute, we did it.
We did it. All right.
So yeah, I think
that wraps us off. And thank you everyone for coming out.
Yeah, Jem, thank you everyone.